In the year 1615, the ambassador of the King of England arrived at the court of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir and begged for permission to trade. The emperor barely looked at him. England was a cold, irrelevant island on the edge of the world. The Mughal Empire, at that moment, produced more wealth in a single year than England would produce in a decade. 140 years later, 200 merchants from that same cold island owned the emperor's throne. The Mughal Empire at its peak controlled 25% of the entire world's economic output, more than all of Europe combined. Its weavers produced fabrics so fine that the finest muslin from the city of Dhaka was called woven air. A bolt of it could pass through a finger ring. Its port of Surat handled more trade than London and Amsterdam together. Its emperors sat on a throne encrusted with diamonds and rubies that no European monarch could have afforded to buy. And it was taken from them not by a conquering king with a vast army, not by plague or famine or revolution, but by a corporation, a trading company. 218 investors who pooled £72,000 in the year 1600 and asked Queen Elizabeth for a charter to trade with Asia. This is the story of the British East India Company, and how the world's greatest commercial enterprise became the most audacious act of theft in human history. To understand what the East India Company eventually stole, you first have to understand what the Mughal Empire actually was. It was founded in 1526 when Babur, a Central Asian prince descended from both Genghis Khan and Timur, invaded northern India and defeated the existing sultan at the First Battle of Panipat. The Mughals were foreign conquerors who, unlike many foreign conquerors, made themselves at home. They adopted Persian as their court language, blended Islamic and Indian artistic traditions, and built some of the most beautiful architecture the world has ever seen. The high point of Mughal glory came under Emperor Shah Jahan in the 17th century. He built the Taj Mahal as a tomb for his beloved wife Mumtaz, a structure whose construction consumed the annual tax revenue of entire provinces and employed 20,000 workers for 22 years. He sat on the peacock throne, a seat of solid gold studded with rubies, emeralds, and pearls, topped by 2 golden peacocks with tails of inlaid sapphires. The cost of the throne alone exceeded the annual budget of the entire British government. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, England was a minor power struggling to find its place in the global economy. The Spanish and Portuguese had locked up the spice trade through their routes around Africa and South America. English merchants desperately wanted access to the same pepper, nutmeg, and cloves that were making Lisbon and Seville rich. On the last day of the year, 1600, 218 of them persuaded Queen Elizabeth to give them a royal charter and a monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. The East India Company was born. The company's first ships arrived in India in 1608, docking at the great port of Surat on India's western coast. The Mughal officials who received them were polite but unimpressed. England was known to the Mughals as a cold, distant island that produced wool and fish. The English merchants, by contrast, had never seen anything like Surat, a city processing more trade in a single day than many English towns handled in a year. They wanted in. The question was how to persuade the most powerful emperor on earth to let them. The answer arrived unexpectedly. In 1612, a small fleet of East India Company ships encountered a much larger Portuguese fleet near Surat and defeated it. The Portuguese had been trying to control access to Indian ports for over a century, and the Mughals despised them. Emperor Jahangir was delighted. The English had done something useful. He granted the company the right to trade in Surat and build a factory, which in the language of the time meant a warehouse and trading post, not a manufacturing plant. The company had its foot in the door. In 1615, King James sent a formal ambassador to Jahangir's court, Sir Thomas Roe, a diplomat of considerable ability. He spent 3 years at the Mughal court, watching the emperor bathe, attend ceremonies, and dispense justice. He wrote detailed letters home describing the unimaginable wealth on display, and he failed at his primary mission. He had hoped to negotiate a formal commercial treaty. Jahangir had no interest in a formal treaty with England. What the company got was informal permission to trade, which, it turned out, was enough to get started. For the next several decades, the East India Company did exactly what it said it would do: trade. English cloth went to India. Indian cotton, silk, saltpeter, and indigo came back to England. The company built trading posts. At Surat, then at Madras in 1639, then at Bombay in 1661, then at Calcutta in 1690. These were not military bases. They were counting houses, warehouses, and the modest residences of company employees. The Mughal Empire barely noticed them. What the company was selling back in England was revolutionary. Indian cotton was cheaper, finer, and easier to wash than English wool. Indian printed cotton fabrics, calicos and chintzes, became a fashion craze in England and across Europe. The English wool industry lobbied Parliament to ban Indian textiles. Parliament eventually passed laws doing exactly that. The company simply redirected those exports to other European markets and kept making money. The profits were extraordinary. Early shareholders received returns of several 100% on their investment. Then, in 1707, Emperor Aurangzeb died. Aurangzeb had been the last great Mughal, a fierce, disciplined, deeply religious ruler who had spent his final decades fighting endless wars in the Deccan Plateau of southern India. His wars had exhausted the empire's treasury. His religious policies had alienated Hindu subjects. And his death triggered a succession crisis that never really ended. In the 30 years after Aurangzeb died, the Mughal Empire had 12 different emperors. The provinces that had sent tax revenue to Delhi began keeping it for themselves. The collapse of Mughal central authority created a new political reality that the East India Company was perfectly positioned to exploit. The subcontinent fragmented into competing successor states. The Nawabs of Bengal, Awadh, and Hyderabad, the Maratha Confederacy in the west and center, and dozens of smaller kingdoms. These states needed military support. They needed loans. They needed reliable suppliers of saltpeter for gunpowder and other war materials. The company, with its ships, its money, and its growing collection of trading posts, could provide all of it, and it asked for payment in territory and trading rights. The company also faced a rival. The French East India Company, backed by the French government, was pursuing the same strategy on the other side of the subcontinent. The two companies fought each other through a series of proxy wars, backing competing Indian rulers and using locally recruited Indian soldiers, sepoys, as the bulk of their forces. The conflict forced the company to build a real military. By the 1740s, what had started as a few security guards protecting warehouses had grown into a private army of tens of thousands of soldiers, with artillery, cavalry, and a chain of fortified positions across India's coasts. The man who turned the company from a trading company with soldiers into a conquering empire was Robert Clive. He had arrived in India in 1744 as a junior company clerk at 18 years old, described by his supervisors as sullen, difficult, and possibly suicidal. What he found there was war. He had a natural genius for military improvisation, extraordinary personal courage, and a complete absence of scruple about the methods he used. He was, by any reasonable definition, a brilliant and deeply unpleasant man. In 1756, the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, a young ruler who had just inherited power, looked at the East India Company's activities in Calcutta and saw something he didn't like. The company was fortifying its trading post, expanding its military presence, and sheltering people he considered political enemies. He ordered them to stop. The company's representatives essentially told him to mind his own business. Siraj-ud-Dowlah marched on Calcutta with 50,000 men and captured it in a day. The company's garrison fled. The company sent Robert Clive from Madras with a force of roughly 3,000 men to retake Calcutta. He did that relatively easily, but Clive then made a decision that went far beyond his orders. He decided not just to retake Calcutta. He decided to take Bengal itself. He had identified something the company wanted even more than trade rights: the tax revenues of Bengal, the richest province in India, with 35 million inhabitants and agricultural and manufacturing output that dwarfed anything in the British Isles. To get it, he would need to do something that was not quite war. Clive made contact with Mir Jafar, the commander-in-chief of Siraj-ud-Dowlah's army. Mir Jafar was an ambitious man who believed he deserved to be Nawab. Clive offered him a deal. Keep your troops out of the coming battle, let the company destroy Siraj-ud-Dowlah, and you will be the new Nawab of Bengal. In exchange, you will pay the company an enormous sum from the Bengal treasury and grant extensive trading concessions. Mir Jafar agreed. The fate of Bengal was decided not on a battlefield but in a secret negotiation. On the 23rd of June, 1757, the two armies faced each other near the village of Plassey on the banks of the Bhagirathi River. Siraj-ud-Dowlah had 50,000 soldiers, 53 cannons, and a force of French artillery advisors. Robert Clive had roughly 3,000 men. By any reasonable military calculation, the battle should have been over in an hour. But 35,000 of Siraj's soldiers, under Mir Jafar's command, simply stood still. They watched. They did not fire a single shot throughout the entire engagement. The 15,000 men who did fight were routed. A thunderstorm soaked their gunpowder during the battle while the company's forces had protected their ammunition under canvas covers. Siraj ad-Dawla fled the field. Within days, he was caught and killed by Mir Jafar's own son. The Battle of Plassey lasted a few hours. It was barely a battle. More of a large-scale ambush arranged by the company through bribery and conspiracy. But its consequences were larger than almost any battle ever fought. The richest province of the world's wealthiest empire now belonged to a trading company. What happened next in Bengal established the pattern the company would follow everywhere. Robert Clive personally walked into the Bengal treasury and collected £234,000. His senior officers each took proportional fortunes. The new puppet Nawab Mir Jafar made payments to the company totaling millions of pounds more. Company employees at every level extracted bribes, gifts, and forced purchases at their own prices. The word that British officials used for it was gifts. What it was looting on a systematic scale that the world had rarely seen. In 1765, the company formalized its control over Bengal with an arrangement called the Diwani, the right to collect taxes from the entire province of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, who no longer had the power to refuse anything, formally granted this right to the company. The East India Company was no longer a trading company that happened to have soldiers. It was now a government, collecting taxes from 35 million people and deciding how to spend that money. The answer to how it spent the money was enriching shareholders in London. The consequences for Bengal were catastrophic. The company extracted Bengal's agricultural surplus through taxation while simultaneously destroying Bengal's textile industry by flooding it with cheap imports. In 1770, a severe drought combined with the company's agricultural policies to produce one of the worst famines in Indian history. An estimated 10 million people died, 1/3 of Bengal's entire population. The East India Company continued collecting taxes throughout the famine. In some districts, tax collection actually increased during the famine years. The shareholders in London received their dividends. The pattern established in Bengal was replicated across India over the following decades. The company would identify a succession dispute or political conflict in an Indian state, offer military support to one side, win the conflict, install a puppet ruler, demand enormous compensation payments, and then gradually absorb the state's governance functions under the justification that the local ruler had accumulated debt he could not repay. It was a system of conquest through the balance sheet rather than through the battlefield. By 1784, the situation had become so extreme that even the British Parliament was alarmed. The company's employees were returning to England as multimillionaires. They were called nabobs, a corruption of the word nawab, and they were buying up seats in Parliament and country houses. Parliament passed the India Act of 1784, creating a board of control to oversee the company's political decisions. The company retained its commercial monopoly and its private army, but its most extreme abuses were theoretically subject to British government oversight. The company's military continued to grow at a pace that would have seemed fantastical to the 218 merchants who signed the original charter. By the early 19th century, the East India Company's private army was larger than the British Army. It had over 200,000 soldiers, the largest standing army in the world commanded by a corporation. It had its own navy. It had its own administrative apparatus that governed more people than any European state. The 200 merchants had become an empire. In 1803, the East India Company's forces marched into Delhi. The city fell after a single battle. The company's commander entered the Red Fort and found there the aged Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, nearly blind, sitting on what remained of the peacock throne. The Koh-i-Noor diamond was already gone, taken by the Persian conqueror Nadir Shah 60 years earlier. What was left was an old man in an empty palace. The company did not depose Shah Alam II. It did something more humiliating. It kept him on the throne as a figurehead, placed him under the protection of a company resident, and paid him an allowance. The world's most powerful emperor became a pensioner of a merchant corporation. He continued to issue grand-sounding imperial decrees from the Red Fort. The company's officials received them politely and ignored them entirely. The Mughal Empire, which had commanded 25% of the world's wealth, now existed as a diplomatic fiction maintained by a trading company for political convenience. The question historians have wrestled with ever since is, how did this happen? How did the richest, most powerful empire in the world end up controlled by a trading company from a country that, just 2 centuries earlier, its emperor had barely deigned to acknowledge? The answer has several parts, and none of them involve the simple story of inevitable European superiority. The Mughal Empire was not conquered because India was weak. It was taken apart because a very particular set of circumstances and a very specific kind of corporate predator had never existed before in history. The first part of the answer is the Mughal succession crisis. Aurangzeb's exhausting wars and his death without a clear successor shattered the central authority that had made the empire work. The provincial governors became independent in practice while remaining loyal in name. This fragmentation meant there was no unified Indian response to the company's expansion. Each Nawab faced the company alone. Each made individual deals that seemed reasonable locally, but collectively transferred power to the company piece by piece. The second part of the answer is the company's unique organizational form. It was not a kingdom that could be fought as a kingdom. It was not a religion that could be opposed on religious grounds. It was a corporation. It existed to maximize returns for shareholders, and it pursued that goal with a focus and a patience that no individual ruler or dynasty could match. When a strategy failed, the company tried a different strategy. When direct conquest attracted too much political opposition, it used debt and dependency. It was the most adaptable predator in political history. The third part of the answer is the sepoys, the Indian soldiers who fought for the company. The company's army was overwhelmingly Indian. At its peak, roughly 85% of the East India Company's military forces were Indian soldiers trained and organized along European lines. These sepoys were disciplined, effective, and loyal to the company that paid them regularly. The company conquered India largely with Indian soldiers, and the money to pay those soldiers came from the taxes extracted from the territory already conquered. The fourth part is the most uncomfortable: local collaboration. At every stage of the company's expansion, Indian merchants, bankers, and nobles provided crucial support. The Jagat-Seth banking family of Bengal helped finance the coup at Plassey and profited enormously from Mir Jafar's takeover. Indian merchants provided the company with credit, intelligence, and local knowledge. They did this because it was profitable in the short term and because nobody in 1757 could have predicted where this would end 2 generations later. What the company extracted from India is almost impossible to calculate precisely, but economists have tried. The historian Utsa Patnaik calculated that Britain drained approximately $45 trillion from India in today's money between 1765 and 1938. What is not disputed is the mechanism. The company collected taxes from Indians in rupees, used those rupees to buy Indian goods, exported those goods to Britain and the world, and kept the profits in London. India was taxed to pay for its own extraction. In 1857, the Indian soldiers of the company's own army rose in revolt. The event the British called the Sepoy Mutiny and Indians called the First War of Independence. The trigger was a new rifle cartridge that soldiers believed was greased with pig and cow fat, an insult to both Muslim and Hindu soldiers. But the cartridge was only the spark. Beneath it lay decades of religious insults, land seizures, the destruction of Indian industries, and the accumulated resentment of a country that had been methodically stripped of its wealth. The rebellion was brutal and was brutally suppressed. When it was over, the British government decided that the East India Company had become ungovernable. In August 1858, Parliament dissolved the East India Company and transferred its territories directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria became Empress of India. The company that had started as 218 merchants pooling their savings on New Year's Eve in 1600 was wound up after 257 years in business. Its greatest product was an empire it had never officially set out to build. The legacy of what the company did to India is still being argued today. What is beyond argument is the scale of the transformation. India's share of world economic output fell from 25% when the company arrived to less than 4% by the time British rule ended. The Mughal Empire had indeed been the world's wealthiest. It did not stay that way. Robert Clive, the man most responsible for the company's conquest of Bengal, returned to England a multimillionaire. When asked before Parliament how he had acquired his enormous fortune, he reportedly said that he was astonished at his own moderation, meaning that, given what he could have taken, he had been quite restrained. He died by his own hand in 1774. History has not been equally forgiving. Mir Jafar, the man who betrayed Bengal at Plassey, became Nawab but found his throne entirely hollow. He tried to free himself from company influence, was deposed, reinstalled, deposed again, and died in 1765 with no real power. In Bengali culture, his name became a permanent insult. Mir Jafar means traitor in the way that Judas does in Christian cultures. The throne he had been promised turned out to be a chair in a room that belonged to someone else. He had sold the independence of 35 million people for something he never actually received. In 1615, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir sat on his golden throne and listened to England's ambassador beg for trading rights. He was the ruler of the richest empire in the world. England was an afterthought. 200 years later, the emperor's successor sat in the same palace, kept alive by a monthly allowance from a merchant corporation, issuing decrees that nobody obeyed. The world's wealthiest empire had not been defeated in battle. It had been purchased, piece by piece, province by province, bribe, by 200 men with a charter and a very clear idea of what they wanted. No army in history ever conquered so much. No corporation in history ever got away with so much. They were, in the end, the same thing.